This is really a good question that a lot of people need answers to. When you hear someone quoting something that's Islamic, we have to take into consideration, what are they actually quoting? Are they quoting the Quran? Or are they quoting the Hadith? In order to understand the Quran, whoever is reading it needs to understand that the Quran was written in 7th century Arabic, which was referred to as Qurayshi or Hijazi Arabic. Now, the one thing to take into consideration is there are different dialects of Arabic. So a certain word in a certain area may mean one thing, while that same word in another area may mean something else. So to fully comprehend what the Quranic verses are saying, one has to be very familiar with the type of language and the dialect that it was written in. Because obviously, to interpret verses, a person who's reading it is going to rely on what that specific verse means to them based on the choice of words that are used. Now, putting that aside, you have these elements called hadiths. Hadiths are basically, in the English language, you would say these are examples that were written down over a 300-year period after the life of the prophet, which means they were hearsay narrations that were put into several books. There are hundreds of thousands of different hadith, and the reason why they exist, because at the time that the Quran was revealed, even though it was written down and it was memorized, most people during that time were not literate. So there was no way for them to go back and try to make sense of what was said. There was no way for them to go back and actually read it and use it as a guide, if you will. So they relied on asking elders who were familiar with the Quran. So if someone, let's say a small tribe, that had a question about something that needed to be handled, they would go to an elder in the community who would be a person that potentially could have been a hafiz, which is a person who memorized the Quran, or they had a written documentation, and they would ask them, hey, Sheikh, this is what's going on. What do we need to do? And if the Sheikh didn't have an exact verse out of the Quran that would give him guidance, he would use what he had heard through other people to say, this is what you're supposed to do because the prophet said this. So you could see where the element of hearsay is now plays a role into giving guidance. And these elements are basically formative examples of how the prophet handled something, or how something was supposed to be handled. You could see that when you involve human beings into hearsay, context can change. Stories can change. And one thing you have to understand about the Arabic culture is it is an oral culture. That means a lot of things are passed down just simply by word of mouth. So what happened over a 300-year period, they took this information and they wrote it down. And you could have hadith that say to have a good chain of narration, which means that they have looked at the authenticity. Did this person who said it, was it a credible person? Did they actually have connections to the other person who said it? So you could see where there's a lot of room for mistakes. And there are hadith that one person says the prophet said this about this specific situation, but then there'll be another hadith that says something totally different. And these two people were supposed to be present during the same time. So you could see where there's, I wouldn't say contradictions, but there are differences in how things were interpreted. Therefore, when you look at hadith, you have to approach it from a logical perspective and basically say, is that really what the prophet said? Is that really the interpretation of this particular situation? So you can see where the complexity comes in. And we have to look at it from a logical perspective, like you do in the Western society when it comes to court. If evidence is to be introduced in court, there has to be a chain of custody that has to be established. Meaning, if a police officer says this evidence was recovered from this place, there has to be photographs, there has to be tangible evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that yes, this is actually related to this particular crime. This is why hearsay testimony is not admissible in a criminal trial. However, when you're dealing with an oral society, things change. Credibility is given to the person's age, to the person's status, to the person's standing in the community. A lot of different factors come into giving credibility. So you could see where there's going to be questions, and this is where the split happens in so many different denominations and beliefs within the Islamic religion, is because not everyone agrees with everything that's in the hadith. And when it comes to the Quran itself, even the interpretation relies on what we call tafsir. And tafsir is equivalent to exegesis, meaning scholars got together and they said, hey, this is what this thing meant. And that's specifically for the verses in the Quran. Hadith totally different element. And when you look at two major sects in Islam, which is Shia and Sunni, they have different hadith. So the way to look at it is when you hear someone say someone is a Muslim and this is what Muslims believe, you really have to get into the details of, first of all, which sect do they come off of? Second of all, which set of hadith do they believe in? And then within that sect, does this particular denomination believe in this specific hadith, or is the denomination they follow even accept this specific hadith book? Because this is where the subsects or the denominations splinter off at the bottom. And a lot of Muslims don't understand this. There are so many denominations in Islam. There are various denominations under Shia, and there are almost 3 times as many under Sunni. This is a very, very complex issue. At the end of the day, when you hear someone say this is what Muslims believe, that doesn't apply to all Muslims, because those things are left to interpretation based on which books that specific denomination follows.